The courtroom smelled like old wood and sweat. It was mid-July in Manhattan, and the air hung thick even with the tall windows propped open. Outside, the city hummed with traffic and voices, but inside, everyone sat still, the kind of still that comes when people are watching something they know they'll talk about later. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat at the defense table with his hands folded in front of him. He wore a dark suit, pressed clean, and his posture was straight but not stiff. His face gave nothing away. No anger, no fear. Just a quiet kind of presence that filled the room without trying to. People called him Bumpy. Some said it with respect, others said it like a curse. But everyone said it. The prosecution table sat across from him, and behind it was a man named Gerald Whitman. Whitman was younger, maybe 35, with blonde hair slicked back and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of marble. He wore a gray suit that cost more than most men in that room made in a month. His shoes shined. His cufflinks caught the light. He looked like someone who had never lost anything he wanted to keep. The gallery was packed. Reporters leaned forward in the back rows with notebooks open. A few policemen stood near the doors, arms crossed, eyes locked on Bumpy. Civilians filled the rest of the seats, some curious, some angry, some just there because they heard his name and wanted to see the man behind it. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was more than a man. He was a symbol. To some, he was protection. To others, he was everything wrong with the neighborhood. But no one could ignore him. The judge sat high on his bench, an older man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His name was Arthur Brennan, and he had been on the bench for 20 years. He had seen plenty of cases, plenty of criminals, plenty of lawyers who thought they were smarter than everyone else. But today, something felt different. He could feel it in the air, in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way Whitman kept glancing at Bumpy like he was sizing him up for something more than a conviction. The charges were racketeering and extortion, the kind of charges that could put a man away for a decade if the jury believed the story. The prosecution had witnesses lined up, people who said they paid Bumpy for protection, people who said they saw him collect money, people who said they were scared of him, but so far, none of them had looked him in the eye when they testified. The trial had been going for 3 days. 3 long days of testimony that painted Bumpy as a kingpin, a menace, a man who controlled Harlem through fear and violence. The prosecution brought in shopkeepers who said they paid him weekly. They brought in a bartender who said Bumpy's men came around every Friday like clockwork. They brought in a woman who said her husband disappeared after he refused to cooperate. But when the defense had their turn, a different picture emerged. The same shopkeepers admitted they were never threatened. The bartender said the money was for keeping troublemakers out, not for protection from Bumpy himself. The woman admitted she never actually saw Bumpy or his men near her husband. The prosecution had a story, but the defense had doubt. And in a courtroom, doubt was everything. Still, everyone knew the real trial wasn't about evidence. It was about perception. About who the jury believed when they looked at Bumpy Johnson, a community protector or a criminal, a man who filled a gap the police wouldn't fill, or a man who exploited his own people. The line between the two was thin, and everyone in that room knew it. Whitman stood and buttoned his jacket. He walked toward the defense table slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew every eye in the room was on him. He stopped a few feet away from Bumpy and tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice smooth and sharp at the same time. "You've built quite a reputation in Harlem, haven't you?" Bumpy didn't answer. His lawyer, a man named Louis Carver, sat beside him and started to stand, but Bumpy put a hand on his arm, just a light touch. Carver sat back down. Whitman smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said he already knew the answer to every question he was about to ask. "You know," Whitman continued, pacing now, "I grew up not far from here, Brooklyn. My father worked on the docks, 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. He never missed a day, never complained, never asked for anything he didn't earn. He paused and looked back at Bumpy. He taught me that a man's character is built on honesty, on hard work, on respect for the law. The courtroom was silent. No one coughed, no one whispered. Whitman let the words hang there for a moment, then turned back to face Bumpy directly. "But you," he said, his voice dropping lower, "you've never worked an honest day in your life, have you?" Carver stood this time. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate." Counsel is not asking questions, he's giving a speech. Judge Brennan looked at Whitman over his glasses. "Mr. Whitman, do you have a question for the defendant, or are we here for theater?" Whitman nodded. "I do, Your Honor." He took a step closer to Bumpy. "Mr. Johnson, how many people in Harlem are afraid of you?" Carver objected again, but Bumpy raised his hand slightly. Carver stopped mid-sentence. Bumpy looked up at Whitman. His eyes were calm, steady, unbothered. "I don't keep count," he said quietly. Whitman's smile widened. "You don't keep count. Interesting. So you admit people are afraid of you. I didn't say that. But you didn't deny it either." Bumpy didn't answer. He just held Whitman's gaze without blinking. Whitman turned and walked back toward his table, then stopped halfway and turned around again. "Let me tell you what I think, Mr. Johnson. I think you're a coward." The room reacted. A few gasps. A murmur that spread like a ripple across water. Judge Brennan raised his hand. "Mr. Whitman, that's enough." But Whitman didn't stop. Something had shifted in him. His face had changed. The polished lawyer was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something raw. He walked back toward Bumpy, faster this time, and his voice rose. "I think you hide behind your reputation. I think you've spent your whole life making people afraid of you because, deep down, you're afraid of them. Afraid of being nothing. Afraid of being forgotten." Carver shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I demand—" "I think you're a parasite," Whitman said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I think you've bled your own community dry and convinced yourself you're some kind of hero. But you're not. You're just a—" He stopped in front of Bumpy and leaned down, close enough that only Bumpy could hear the next words. His voice dropped to a whisper, but his face twisted with something that looked like pain, like he wasn't just talking about Bumpy anymore, like he was talking about something else, someone else. "You're just like the man who killed my brother," he said, so quiet the court reporter couldn't catch it. "You think you're untouchable. You think you're above the law. You think you can do whatever you want and no one can stop you." Bumpy's eyes flickered, just for a second, because he understood now. This wasn't about the case. This wasn't about justice. This was about a young man from Brooklyn who lost someone and never got over it. This was about grief wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. And then Whitman slapped him. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a shove. It was an open-handed slap across the face, sharp and deliberate, the sound of it cracking through the courtroom like a gunshot. The room exploded. People shouted. Reporters stood. The policeman by the door moved forward. Judge Brennan slammed his gavel down again and again, the sound barely cutting through the chaos. Carver grabbed Whitman's arm and pulled him back, yelling something no one could hear over the noise. But Bumpy didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his head turned slightly from the force of the slap, his jaw tight, his hands still folded on the table. His cheek was red, his eyes were closed, and for a long moment no one knew what he was going to do. The people in the gallery held their breath. Some of them had seen Bumpy angry before. They had heard stories about what happened to men who disrespected him. They had heard about broken bones and disappeared bodies and warnings that came in the middle of the night. They knew what he was capable of, and they waited for it. Whitman stood a few feet away, breathing hard, his face flushed. His hand still hung in the air like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. But he didn't apologize. He didn't step back. He just stared at Bumpy, waiting. Maybe hoping. Maybe needing to see the monster he had described. Maybe needing proof that he was right. The room started to quiet. The judge stopped hammering his gavel. The policeman stopped moving. Everyone held their breath. Bumpy opened his eyes. He turned his head slowly and looked at Whitman. His expression hadn't changed. There was no rage, no humiliation, no threat, just that same quiet presence. He stood up, slowly, carefully, the kind of movement that made everyone tense, like they were watching a fuse burn down and didn't know when it would reach the powder. Whitman took a small step back, just one, but it was enough. His bravado cracked. His hand dropped. His shoulders tensed like he was bracing for impact. Bumpy looked at him for a long time. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You hit me because you wanted me to hit you back." Whitman blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. "You wanted me to prove you right," Bumpy continued. "You wanted me to be the animal you told everyone I am. You wanted to give them a reason to lock me up and feel good about it." The courtroom was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. The kind where people forget to breathe because they're afraid they'll miss something. Bumpy took a step toward Whitman. Not aggressive, just closer. "Your father worked the docks, 12 hours a day. You said he never complained, never asked for anything he didn't earn." He paused. "My father worked too. Cotton fields down south, 14 hours a day in the heat. He earned every penny he made, and they still paid him half what they paid a white man for the same work. He never complained either. But not because he was strong, because he knew complaining would get him killed." Whitman's face had gone pale. His eyes were wide, fixed on Bumpy like he was seeing him for the first time. "You think I'm a coward," Bumpy said. "Maybe I am. But I've never hit a man who couldn't hit me back. And I've never pretended the world was fair just because it was fair to me." He stepped back and sat down. He folded his hands on the table again, the same way he had before, like nothing had happened, like the slap hadn't landed, like the room wasn't on fire with tension. Judge Brennan stared at him, then at Whitman. Then he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice rough. Mr. Whitman approached the bench. Now, Whitman walked forward slowly, his shoulders tight, his face unreadable. The judge leaned down and spoke in a low voice, but everyone could hear the anger in it. "If you ever pull a stunt like that in my courtroom again, I will hold you in contempt and have you disbarred. Do you understand me?" Whitman nodded. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked back to his table, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his notes. The judge called a recess, 15 minutes. The gallery emptied slowly, people whispering to each other, looking back at Bumpy as they left. The reporters rushed out to call their editors. This was the story now, not the charges, not the witnesses, the slap, the silence. The choice. Carver leaned over to Bumpy. "You okay?" Bumpy nodded. "I'm fine. That was something," Carver said quietly. "I thought you were going to—" "I know what you thought," Bumpy said. He looked at his lawyer. "Everyone thought that. That's the problem." Carver didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. When court resumed, the energy had changed. Whitman was quieter. His questions were sharper but less personal. He didn't look at Bumpy the same way. The jury noticed. They noticed everything. The trial continued. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The jury listened. But no one in that room forgot what they saw. The slap, the silence. The choice Bumpy made not to swing back. When the closing arguments came, Whitman stood and delivered his case. He talked about the law, about community, about the difference between protection and extortion. He was professional, composed. But there was something missing now, some fire that had burned out. When Carver stood for the defense, he didn't talk about the slap directly. He didn't have to. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "you've heard a lot of testimony over the past few days. You've heard about money changing hands. You've heard about fear. You've heard about control. But I want you to think about something else. I want you to think about character, not the character that gets described in a courtroom, the character that gets revealed in a moment of pressure, the character that shows itself when everything is on the line and no one is watching except everyone." He paused. "You saw something in this courtroom, something that wasn't planned, something that wasn't rehearsed. You saw a man get struck, and you saw how he responded. You saw restraint. You saw control. You saw dignity. And I ask you to remember that when you make your decision. Because that moment told you more about Ellsworth Johnson than any witness ever could." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the verdict was guilty. Bumpy was sentenced to 18 months. He stood when they read it, his face as calm as it had been the day Whitman hit him. He nodded once to the judge, then let the officers lead him out. But something had shifted, in the courtroom, in the reporters who wrote about it, in the people who heard the story later, passed from one person to another in barber shops and kitchens and street corners. They didn't talk about the conviction. They talked about the slap. They talked about the silence. They talked about the man who could have burned the room down and chose not to. Gerald Whitman went on to have a long career. He won cases. He made partner at his firm. He appeared in newspapers. But he never spoke about that day in court. When people asked him about Bumpy Johnson, he changed the subject. Years later, a reporter found him at a charity event and asked him about it directly. Whitman was older then, gray at the temples, his face lined with years. He looked at the reporter for a long time before he answered. "I wanted to provoke him," he said quietly. "I wanted to prove he was dangerous, that he didn't belong in civilized society. But all I proved was that I didn't belong in that courtroom." He paused. He had more control in that moment than I've had in my entire life. The reporter asked if he regretted it. Whitman looked away, out the window at the city below. "Every day," he said, "not because of what happened to me, but because I let my pain turn into someone else's test, and he passed it. I didn't. Bumpy Johnson served his time. When he got out, he went back to Harlem. The streets hadn't changed much. The people still knew his name, but something in him had changed. He was quieter, more careful, less interested in proving anything to anyone. He never talked about what happened in court. When people asked, he just shook his head and smiled a little. 'Man hit me,' he'd say. 'I didn't hit him back. That's the whole story.' But it wasn't the whole story. It was the beginning of something else. A reminder that strength doesn't always look like fire. That sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is nothing at all. The courtroom that day held two men. One believed power came from force. The other believed it came from control. One wanted to destroy. The other wanted to survive. And in that moment, when the room held its breath and waited for violence, it got something else instead. It got a glimpse of what it means to choose. Not because the choice was easy, not because it didn't cost something, but because it was the only choice that mattered. The judge retired a few years later. On his last day on the bench, someone asked him what case he remembered most. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "There was a man once who got slapped in my courtroom, and he didn't slap back. I've seen a lot of men in my life, strong men, brave men, violent men, but I've never seen a man stronger than the one who could have destroyed everything and didn't." He didn't say Bumpy's name, he didn't have to. The story spread. It changed as stories do. Some people said Bumpy smiled when he got hit. Some said he whispered something to Whitman that made him go pale. Some said the whole courtroom stood up and applauded. None of that was true, but the truth was simpler and harder to carry. A man got hit, and he chose not to hit back, not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, but because he understood something the rest of the room didn't. That power isn't in the fist. It's in the choice not to use it. That dignity isn't given. It's claimed in the moment everyone expects you to lose it. That sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay silent. In Harlem, they still tell the story. Old men sitting on stoops, mothers teaching their sons, teachers talking to students about history that doesn't make it into textbooks. They tell it different ways with different details, but the center holds. A man was tested. A man chose restraint. A man walked out of that courtroom convicted but not defeated. Because defeat isn't about what the system does to you. It's about what you do to yourself when the system pushes. And Bumpy Johnson, in that moment, refused to be what they needed him to be. He refused to confirm their fears. He refused to play the role they wrote for him. He just sat there, took the hit, and stayed human. The courtroom is empty now. The case is closed. The men are gone. But the moment remains, not in files or transcripts or newspaper clippings, but in the quiet space between instinct and decision, in the breath before the choice, in the second where everything could have gone one way and went another instead. And in that second, a man named Bumpy Johnson taught a room full of people something they didn't expect to learn, that the hardest fight isn't the one you win. It's the one you walk away from.